To the second session of the Digital Transformation in Government Conference. Now we have the pleasure of welcoming Robert Bob Gordon. He's the strategic of the Excuse me, sorry, there's a latency issue I'm just addressing. He's a strategic advisor to the Canadian Cyber Threat Exchange, and he's going to be presenting on the cyber landscape in the new Cold War. Bob is a strategic advisor, as I mentioned, to the Canadian Cyber Threat Exchange that we have in the Canadian government. It's fairly unique, and it allows private sector organizations to share and analyze threat information and enable collaboration across all sectors. It's been quite successful, and he was one of the founding members for that. Before that, he was the executive director, he was the director of global cybersecurity at CGI. And that included working mainly with the Canadian federal government. He was Canada's first cybersecurity strategy author, and for that he received the Deputy Minister's Achievement Award. He has a unique career. He has served in multiple security, intelligence, and law enforcement organizations, notably Public Safety Canada, the Communication Security Establishment, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. He's held senior executive positions, including at the Senior Assistant Deputy Minister level, and he was responsible for science and technology, information management, and internal security programs. He has provided operational leadership in investigating and analyzing the full range of threats to the security of Canada, which included leading the Canadian Centre for the CSIS counterterrorism program. He's also a member of the board of directors for Quantum Safe Canada, and he's also on the advisory board for the Master of Cybersecurity and Threat Intelligence program, which is being given at the University of Guelph. So without further ado, I'm very much looking forward to your presentation, and I thank you very much for taking the time to present. Over to you, Bob.
Good morning, and thank you, Bob, for the kind introduction and the invitation to participate at your conference today. I know this will come up on a couple of other presentations. I'll make my slides available at the end of the session. For the past couple of days, we've heard from a lot of experts on the great strides that are being made in the digital transformation in government. There's been some really or truly inspirational success stories. I took a lot of notes from some of the great things that's being done. What I'm going to be talking about are some of those things that may be getting into the way, or you need to be thinking about as you're going through and preparing that transformation process. And specifically, I'm going to be talking about the cyber threat environment. I'm going to talk a little bit about who's attacking, and then you can't be talking about that in today's environment without actually talking and spending a little bit of time looking at what's going on in the Russia-Ukraine context. So I'm going to be looking at that's all the downside to it. But then the other side, I want to leave you with some positive things. So I'll talk about how we're responding at things like the national level, internationally, and what the private sector is actually doing to try to improve the cyber situation. So one of the things that certainly all of us are aware of is the last couple of years have really created a new environment for the IT world. When you talk about the human side of it, it's all the things that impacted us. Everything from we've changed completely the way we work as individuals. It's the working from home. It's the shopping from home. It's doing everything from home. And at the same time, recognizing that all of us are the biggest contributors into the entire cybersecurity environment. We're the critical part of it. But one of the things that's been working in conjunction with that is the responsibility for IT units to start to deal with the changes or the consequence of doing that. So how do we accelerate? What they did was accelerated that transformation process that was going on. So things that the companies were looking at doing over the next 3 to 5 years happened in about a two-week period. They had to start thinking about sort of how and where are we delivering services? What kind of services are we actually delivering? And in some cases, actually delivering brand new services that hadn't been dreamed about in the past. And what that's done is change the dynamic between the IT community and the business side. Those two units have got to be talking closer together. IT's now got to be thinking about what are the new business offerings that are coming out? And how will IT enable that? And unfortunately, in the security world, in the past, we were really good at saying, no, you can't do that. And we've got to change that mindset. We've got to be saying, as security professionals, how do we enable that business transformation, that technology transformation as it's going along, so we can offer those new services that are coming along. I mean, we heard a little bit about that over the last couple of days. I was impressed with the comments that came from Scott Taylor at Shared Services and some of the challenges that they had during COVID and its impact on government transformation plans. Also yesterday, Rochelle Porteous at FinTrack talked about how she had to create a sort of matrix teams, becoming much more agile. And that was the environment that we're working in. And at the same time, we had a technology world. You know, we had some really complex systems. We had to quickly adapt into this new environment. And some of the old systems we have, particularly in the operational technology environment, they're really difficult to update and patch. So that's the environment that we've been working. That's the environment that we've been making this transformation in. And unfortunately, we've been demonstrating our resolve in doing it, but there's a whole bunch of factors out there, are people in the names of criminals and nation states that are trying to seize the opportunity, trying to seize this transformation and the things that are shaking up in the environment to their advantage and to our disadvantage. And certainly when we're looking at the notices that are coming out to us from the federal government, from Canada's two intelligence services, the warnings have been very stark coming out. Shelley Bruce, the Chief of the Communications Security Establishment, talks about how cybercrime is now the most pervasive threats to Canadian business. And CSE put out an assessment 2 years ago. They're in the process of updating that. And there was two key judgments that I think are particularly noteworthy. One is how cybercrime continues to be the cyber threat that's most likely going to impact Canadians and Canadian organizations. The other thing that was a real change for a government document was coming out and actually naming state sponsors of attacks coming at Canada. So for the first time that I can remember, they named China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea as posing the greatest strategic threats to Canada, and how these states have the capacity to disrupt Canada's critical infrastructure and things like supply of electricity to further their goals. CSIS, in its annual report that was just released a couple of months ago, they also raised the concerns about cyber-enabled espionage and sabotage and foreign influence activity. So who are these attackers? What are they seeking, and how are they doing it? The first are nation states as cyber attackers. Their motivation is some of the traditional stuff. They're after espionage. They want to steal secrets, intellectual property. They want to know what the government's doing. But increasingly, we're seeing states using cyber attacks as a way to conduct what we call statecraft. How do they do the influence operations? How do they try to change the nature or the beliefs or the policies of other countries? Primary attackers, as mentioned in the threat reports that have come in from the government, are Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. Nothing particularly surprising there. We've heard about that, but they're not the only states. There's a proliferation of other countries that aren't as effective, but are certainly getting involved in statecraft through cyber. Typically, the targets are into government agencies. They're the main target, or think tanks, also into critical infrastructure. But increasingly, we're seeing them going after some critical infrastructure areas, particularly if there's intellectual property that they can be taking and bringing back to their country and passing along to the benefit of their private sector. The techniques that states use is different than what we see other threat actors using. They're interested in stealth and access. They want to get inside your system. They want to stay there for a long period of time, and they don't want to get caught at it. And I think back of the Russian attack against the solar winds now 2 years ago. That attack took many months to plan and execute, and they were in there for a long time before they were actually detected. That's the kind of thing that they want to be doing. But the other thing that we're starting to see states do is actually enabling criminals to operate within their jurisdiction. Sometimes it's minimal interference, so they agree not to take action against those criminals, providing that the criminal, when called upon, will actually undertake activity on behalf of the nation states. So it's a way for sort of plausible deniability of the country that's doing it when they actually get a criminal organization to do that on their behalf. The second are cyber criminals. What are they interested in doing? Stealing money. Somehow they want to make some money out of whatever their activity is doing, usually by committing some type of fraud. And it's getting easier for cyber criminals to get into the business. It's getting much easier to get in because the technical sophistication isn't as high as what it used to be. It's easier to get involved as a non-technical cyber criminal. Unfortunately, the chance of them getting caught pretty limited. So there's the incentive for cash and not much of a cost on getting caught on the other side. And certainly the use of cryptocurrencies has facilitated how payments can actually be made to cyber criminals. You no longer have to walk down the street or give them a check or give them a bag of cash. You can pay them anywhere in the world. The other thing that's come up in the last couple of years are the ransomware attacks. We hear about that in the press all the time. It's now come up as ransomware as a service. They've weaponized essentially ransomware. This really doesn't require technical expertise because as a criminal, you can actually just rent that expertise. And we're seeing the criminals become specialized. So some criminals specialize in getting access into a system. Some are specialists at actually negotiating with the victims on what the payment's going to be. And so as a criminal, you can go in and you can take advantage of all that criminal expertise, and each one of those actors actually just gets a share of whatever you get out of it. And unfortunately, Canada rates, we're high on the list of attackers, partly because of our use of technology. We've adapted technology, but that also makes us attractive in going through it. The other thing about the criminals, as they're operating now, when I say you're running it as a business, they also offer it as things like service guarantees. They offer help desk support. They have loyalty programs where trusted buyers can run the attack system ahead of time. And they'll also help the victims if they've got a problem in actually paying with a cryptocurrency. So they're running this purely as a business enterprise, and they're very profitable. I'm going to talk about that a little later on. Third group are insiders. They can be employees or contractors or vendors. It's literally anyone who's got access into your system. And it's interesting when we start talking about insiders because they're on both sides of the fence. They're both our first line of defense to try to stop attacks from coming in, but they're also a potential threat vector coming in. Sometimes it's just an employee doing the wrong thing, but they did it for the right reason. Sometimes it's just an error. And increasingly, we've seen cases in the last few months where employees are doing it for greed, for cash. They're mad at you, or you've actually got a ransomware attacker coming along and sending emails to your employees and saying, hey, look, for X number of dollars, will you just give me access into your system by clicking on this? So that's a new side of the insider threat. And then lastly, we're talking about hacktivists. And so these are individuals who have they're upset because they think there's some sort of a perceived political or social injustice, and they want to come after you to publicize what you're doing or actually just disrupt your operation. And we're increasingly seeing this playing out in the conflict that's going on in Russia or in Ukraine by Russia. I'm going to talk about that in a second. Unfortunately, some of the other attack vectors haven't gone away either. So we're still seeing things like distributed denial of service or DDoS attacks coming up with record-breaking volumes of attacks coming through, going after things like healthcare, education, e-commerce. And particularly over the last couple of years, those sectors were critical. We call them lifeline industries. We all relied heavily on those. So there was quite an incentive on behalf of those organizations to actually pay ransoms to keep back in business. And business email compromise has been skyrocketing in the last almost 3 years now, increasingly targeting the finance departments of both small and medium-sized companies. We've seen reporting in the press, how some big cities have been attacked by that, but also some small businesses have suffered the same sorts of attacks. So that's who the attackers are. And the question that's been coming up recently, and I think the conflict Russia-Ukraine has spurred this on, is are we entering into some kind of a new war, new Cold War, or what's happening with geopolitics? Well, I really think that the Cold War didn't really end. We just sort of went through a little bit of a lull, but it's certainly back. And it's a little more complicated because in the past, it was mainly a competition in a bipolar world, a competition between Russia, United States, and its allies. But we've now are involving other countries. So it's now become China, North Korea, Iran, and others that are involved in it. So we're starting to see the geopolitics or the engagement or the interaction between states now playing out over the internet. Now, it's not completely new. I mean, we've seen commentators back almost 12 years ago talking about a global war style cyber arms race. And at that time, they were talking about what was going on between the United States and China through the theft of intellectual property. But there's been other examples of that have hit the press. North Korea, for example, their attack against the Sony corporation for perceived injustice of what Sony was doing in releasing the video that was coming out. And then Russia has been responsible or suspected of being responsible for a series of attacks against Ukraine over the past number of years. They took down the Ukrainians' power grid at one point. And they released in 2017, the Russian military intelligence were accused of spreading what was called the NotPetya malware attack. So not only did it affect what was going on in Ukraine in terms of shutting down a lot of government services and private sector, that spread around the world and caused billions of dollars of damage outside of that space. But it's now become a little more of a dangerous environment when we're looking at it. And it's become attractive for states to want to do that, in part because there's a degree of anonymity in doing that, or a degree of deniability, if you want. So states can get involved in this and say, hey, look, it's actually not us that's doing it. And it's now easy to reach literally any point in the world. Countries aren't limited by the extent of their traditional military forces. They can touch anywhere. Doesn't cost them a lot of money relative to other forms of conflict. And we're also starting to see them engaged in manipulating information and decision making. So it's no longer just going in and stealing intellectual property or government secrets. And increasingly, the conversation over the last few months has been what we call this gray zone aggression. And that's where the activity of nation states falls just below the threshold of a formal conflict. It's sort of that invisible fight that's going on. One of the things countries use it for is they want to punish adversaries to affect the morale of countries, increase, tear down that cohesion or the political stability within other countries. And the targets, unfortunately, aren't just governments. And I say unfortunately because quite often the private sector gets dragged into that mix. And so this is becoming a very dangerous environment. And certainly we're seeing that playing out in what's going on with it in Ukraine. I mean, it started off with attacks now, or we're seeing attacks from Russia. They're calling it Viper attacks. Basically, that's going in and actually destroying data. We're seeing attacks against satellite systems. So not only is that disrupting what's going on in Ukraine, but we're also seeing that affecting the delivery of the internet and telecommunications capability in neighboring countries. We're seeing websites being disrupted, at banks, the inability of them to carry on is going on. And certainly from a Canadian perspective, there's concern about the conflict in Ukraine spilling over into Canada's critical infrastructure sector. And Canada's the Centre for Cybersecurity, the federal government's organization, has been issuing a series of warnings about that risk to raise the awareness for critical infrastructure sectors to start to take some mitigation activity. So when we look at geopolitics, there's three blocks or groups of players that we're looking at. Certainly the one I mentioned before are hacktivists. So we've got groups like Anonymous that we've heard about before, where they've just declared that they're waging a cyber war, in this case against Russia. They're siding with Ukraine. The Cyber Partisans, an ad hoc group created in Belarus. Their objective is to try to disrupt Russia's ability to move troops through Belarus on the train system. We're seeing nation states, not only the activity that they're doing themselves, traditional state activity, but we're also seeing them encourage the formation of civilian entities to actually take up use cyber as a way to inflict damage on the adversary. In Ukraine, there was the IT Army Ukraine was established. And then certainly criminals are taking sides in this. If you're a Russian-based criminal organization, your allegiance is to Russia. Those organizations are doing attacks into Ukraine, and supporters of Ukraine. The Conti criminal organization is a fairly substantial organization. This is big business, as I mentioned. They've got 100 paid employees in their organization. So this is not a small-time operation. But it's interesting in the criminal group, that the criminals are actually, in some of the organizations, are actually splitting. So we saw in Conti, some of the Conti criminal enterprise decided they want to actually support Ukraine. So the organization started to split. Conti is still a very viable organization, criminal organization, but you're starting to see some of that splitting. And one of the things that I wonder about is what happens when we're talking about hacktivists and criminals. What happens if either of those groups start to think that their side is going to lose in this conflict? Would they do something, or would they be willing to engage in some kind of activity that a nation state might be reluctant to do? They've already demonstrated that they do not follow the rule of law. So they certainly don't follow the rules that nation states go by. So what happens as this conflict continues to play out? And we don't know the answer to that. If we certainly talk about Ukraine and what's going on in Canada and Russia and the United States and our allies are going on, but we're not the only countries that are being impacted. Countries of all sizes are being impacted, particularly small countries that don't have the fulsome response capability that certainly that we do. And we're also seeing nation states starting to use cyber attacks and ransomware attacks as a way to gain financial cash coming into their countries to subsidize other programs that they're running. It's actually become a financial instrument for some of them. North Korea, for example, is one of them. And as I say, we're seeing a lot of small countries starting to be targeted. I mean, this year, we've seen the Conti criminal organization, the group I was just talking about, disrupted operations with both the government and private sector in Costa Rica a couple of months ago, was costing the Costa Rican government about $38 million a day to deal with that. And then last year, there were a lot of attacks against government financial institutions, for example, places like Peru, Malaysia, the Philippines. So it's not just into the traditional countries. It's everyone's affected by this. And one of the things that we tend to get lulled into when we start thinking about cybersecurity and cyber attacks is they become just statistics. But cyber has real world implications. And I'm thinking back to the attacks that occurred against the healthcare system in Canada. Certainly, the big one that got all the press was in Newfoundland and Labrador last fall. But there's been many others, and these attacks have real world consequences, particularly in healthcare. You're starting to see things like ambulances get delayed. So if you're in an ambulance being rushed to a hospital, you no longer go to the closest hospital that can help you. You get diverted someplace where they can actually get you in because their systems are operating. Procedures have to be rescheduled. Cancer treatment and radiation equipment gets disrupted. Basically, the equipment can't be used, and the delivery of medicines actually can be denied or disrupted as we're going through the system, because we completely rely on the digital world to deliver all these services. And we've been talking for the last 2 days about all these services that are being delivered. Well, that great delivery system can be disrupted by physical attacks or cyber attacks coming into it. So that's in healthcare, but you were also seeing those kinds of attacks disrupting things like food and gas. And the result is it affects all of us. It starts to drive up the price of everything. And I'm thinking, looking back last year, the attack against Colonial Pipeline resulted, cyber attack coming in had real world consequences. Colonial had to shut down its delivery of gas to the northeastern United States. So certainly had real world impact through that. And unfortunately, Canada hasn't been immune to that. There's been a lot of Canadian victims, and here's some examples over the past 9 months. And I want to point out, I'm not picking on these organizations. I'm not sending them out that they've done something wrong at all. I'm putting it in here mainly because these were the ones that happen to hit some of the headlines. But there's been thousands of other companies that have equally been impacted by this. I mean, we've had everything from Crown-operated cannabis distributors have been suffered attack. Technology organizations like Panasonic sustained a cyber attack a couple of months ago. And then we've also seen, reports of business law firms or national staffing agencies also being attacked. So the list is quite broad on who's actually been subjected to these kinds of attacks over the last. I think I say these are the last few months have been going on, and it covers the gamut of basically government, private sector, not-for-profits. It doesn't matter who you are, you're subject to a cyber attack. I say, that the attack's becoming real in Canada. There was a really excellent study done by Statistics Canada 2 years ago. So this was done, a survey done before the pandemic. It's considered to be one of the best done in the world because it's done by Statistics Canada. It requires the completion of the survey. And at that time, they found that 21% of Canadian businesses have reported being impacted by a cyber incident in the previous year, the year that the survey was being done. And it was interesting because when I was reading some of the reports coming out of that, the headlines were saying only 20% of Canadian companies were impacted by a cyber incident. And I began to think, okay, so for those of you in Ottawa, that's like walking down Bank Street, and every fifth store or business you walk by was hit by a cyber attack. If that was any other kind of a criminal activity, we'd be beating down the doors of our legislature saying we've got to be doing something better. But for some reason, when we talk about cyber, it's become a nebulous thing. We forget about the human dimension, the real impact on it. So we've got to be doing more about it. We've got to be increasing the rate at which police get informed about it. The reporting rate is down around 12% of crimes or cyber crimes get actually reported to the police, according to Statistics Canada. One of the things, Canadian companies are really being impacted by cyber ransomware attacks, and over half the victims in Canada actually pay the ransom. And it's a bit of a philosophical question as to whether do you pay, do you don't pay. Well, at the end of the story, it comes down to a business decision: should you pay or not going through it? Because there certainly is a cost when a breach occurs. The surveys from last year looks at it's over $6 million for every company, the cost to recover from a breach when it occurs. And small businesses in Canada are particularly among some of the most vulnerable organizations, and they are so essential to the Canadian economy. I mean, they drive the Canadian economy, and a lot of small businesses don't realize that this is a data-driven world that we're now in. So acquiring and using data provides business opportunities, and most businesses in some way rely on data. And the other thing is, because they rely on data, they typically then connect it to the internet, which then increases their vulnerability. And I usually hear two stories or two explanations coming from Canadian businesses as to why they think that cyber is not a problem. The first is that they think they've got nothing of interest. Nobody wants to steal it. They don't have any big trade secrets or intellectual property. But with ransomware attacks, the attacker has no interest in the value of your data. That data only has to be of value to you, and therefore you're willing to pay to get access back to your data. The attacker couldn't care less about the data. It's valueless to them. So every company has got something that's of interest to them. And when we talk about, how bad can it be, it means you can get shut down. It means you no longer get access to that data that enables you to operate day in, day out, whether that be your mailing list, whether that be your invoicing. It's whatever keeps you going, guaranteed that's data, and without it, you're not in business. And unfortunately, we're seeing that a lot of small companies just aren't prepared to deal with a cyber attack. A lot of them have very little, if any, defenses for cyber attacks. 60% of them haven't got any insurance to help them recover from attacks if they go through. Lots of them are being impacted by the cyber attack. I was telling you the statistics on it. And one of the things that report that came out recently is a lot of companies haven't even got sufficient insight into their data, their environment, to actually know whether they've lost data or they've been subjected to attack. So now that's all the bad news story. So before everybody starts rushing out your virtual windows in despair, sort of what are we doing to stop this onslaught? Because there are some things that are working. So let's look at it from the Canadian government level. And there's three broad areas of things we're doing. First, Canada has got a cybersecurity strategy and a strategy for critical infrastructure. That's essential. If you haven't got a plan, you can't execute on it. And we're in the process of updating the National Cybersecurity Strategy. That consultation process will be beginning in the next couple of weeks. The second thing is we've allocated structures within the bureaucracy and given them specific responsibility. We clarified the roles and responsibilities. One of the big things we did was create the Canadian Center for Cybersecurity. An excellent decision on the government, brought into one place the technical advice that the companies and the government can rely on. And they produce excellent material. They give, my organization is a recipient of that. We pass it along to our members. It's the alerts, advisories, reports, assessments, blogs. I mean, you name it, they're doing it to get cyber threat, both the threat information out, but equally as importantly, they're getting information out on what can you actually do to respond to that. We've created a National Cybercrime Coordination Unit within the RCMP to coordinate how law enforcement is being able to respond to cyber threats. And I'll talk a little bit more about the responding to the criminal activity. We've created a certification program within ISED for small and medium-sized businesses called Cybersecure Canada. They're looking at refreshing that as they go along. And then you're starting to see things like the Cyber Center partnering up with groups like the Canadian Internet Registration Authority to produce what's called Canadian Shield. And that's a free protected DNS service that any Canadian, anybody in Canada can sign up for. It's free, and it's a way to help prevent connecting to malicious websites. So, we've got some good structures in there, and we're seeing those federal government structures now working closely with academia, other levels of government, and the private sector. And then last, we're actually allocating funds into the process. So you saw a significant increase in funding going into the government operations announced in the budget a couple of months ago. So that's at the Canadian government level. Internationally, we're starting to see collaboration. I talked about cyber criminals, that their motivation is financial. So the thing we want to be doing is how do we go after and shut off that financial motivation, the ability for the cyber criminals to get and become financially profitable out of the process. So we want to combat ransomware. So there's a collection of countries got together last year to start to come up with some disruptive operations to try to stop the criminals from benefiting from it. One of the things, for example, is how quickly can we trace and interdict crypto payments going around the world. So the attack has occurred, the payment's been made, but then how do we stop the funds from getting through the system and into the attacker? The other is what I call name and shame. It's calling out countries that are involved in cyber attacks. They can't sit back and deny that they're doing something. So get out and start to do with that. You're starting to see like the president's raising this with the Russian president last year. So we're starting to elevate this from just a bureaucratic level up into the political level. And we're also seeing criminal indictments against members of intelligence services, foreign intelligence services, for what they're doing in launching cyber campaigns against us. And one of the most effective is actually doing criminal prosecutions. And that requires a lot of international law enforcement cooperation. We're starting to see more of that going through. On the private sector side, coming out of the World Economic Forum last month, a group of companies got together to create what they're calling the Cyber Resilience Pledge. And what they want to do is a commitment to get together to raise resilience across industry sectors. Really encouraging that the chief executive officer of Suncor actually was one of the first companies to actually sign on to that. And we're seeing other countries getting together to look at how do we harden up the software supply chain to make it harder for criminal organizations to actually get in, or even nation states to get in and disrupt the cyber supply chain. And certainly we're seeing positive results over that. So we're seeing criminals being arrested around the world, and it isn't just in some of the countries you would think. It's things like Kuwait is being done, South Korea. We're starting to see seizures of cryptocurrency that were stolen, and some significant seizures. I mean, we're talking about in the U.S. seizing over $3.5 billion worth of stolen cryptocurrency. So we're starting to see that kind of cooperation. Canada's involved in that. There was an arrest last month of the head of a cybercrime organization operating out of Nigeria. Canada was involved in that whole investigation and takedown of criminals. So Canada is an active participant in that process. And as I mentioned, that Canada we're not immune to cyber attacks, and on the other side, we're also not immune to having Canadians involved in cyber criminal activity. We've had some noteworthy examples of Canadians being involved in some of the big cybercrime organizations. The last was the most noteworthy one was the fellow who was arrested and sentenced in January, February of this year. As an individual, he had made $27 million out of the attacks that he was conducting, going and which some of the victims involved Canadian companies going through. And in all these cases, these are international investigations. So Canada is part of a consortium that goes after. In this case, it was the RCMP and provincial police, along with the Federal Bureau of Investigation in the United States, going after these. So that's what the governments have been doing. But what about the private sector? I mean, the private sector certainly realizes the value of collaboration. They've done that in a variety of ways in the past. And they're finding that in the cyber domain, information sharing is really cost effective. It's a way to leverage the knowledge that others have got. And particularly in this time period where everyone's struggling to find the talent and the resources that we need to be able to deal with technology at large, and certainly in cyber, being able to collaborate like this and to share that information helps to bolster or fill in some of the deficits, deficiencies that we've got, the lack of resources that we have. And because without maintaining situational awareness, it's very difficult to build up a cyber resilience program. You've got to know what's going on inside your system, and collaborating is and sharing is one of the big ways of doing this. Essentially, organizations are realizing they can't do it on their own. For example, all of the major banks in Canada participate in the Canadian Cyber Threat Exchange, the CCTX. They spend hundreds of millions of dollars on cybersecurity, but they realize that even they can't do this on their own, and they participate in the information sharing. And lots of studies coming out that the more sharing that's done, the better you are at being able to both detect, contain, and respond to attacks when they've come through. And also the idea of sharing across sectors. Sharing within a sector accomplishes one goal, but you want to be sharing across sectors, and you also want to be sharing with your supply chain to make sure that all of the elements of the supply chain that are out there are going to be able to come together and actually be able to protect you. For example, if you're a manufacturing company, you may think you've got a really hardened down environment and nobody can get into your environment to do it from a cybersecurity perspective. But that little trucking company that brings the raw products in the morning and the finished goods out in the afternoon, if they're subject to a cyber attack that shuts them down, then it doesn't matter how effective the manufacturing plant was at protecting itself, it's out of a business. It's the most secure but ineffective organization. You've got to be thinking about your entire supply chain and how and where are you working with them to ensure their cyber resilience so it doesn't affect them. And we're starting to see this become recommended as best practices. So we're seeing things from the US Department of Defense, for example, has really instituted a massive program in doing that. But we're starting to see recommendations for companies to be broadening their sharing of information and awareness from groups like the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions. We're seeing the regulatory organizations in Canada recommending, the Canadian Association of Defense and Security Industries, the investments fund industry, and the list goes on. So organizations are starting to realize the value of collaboration and sharing. And effectively, that's what led to the creation of the Canadian Cyber Threat Exchange. A group of companies got together and realized that they've got to be putting some structure around the sharing of information as they go through. So the CCTX was created by the private sector as a not-for-profit organization. We've got companies from all sectors, all sizes, everything from small construction companies to the major banks to retail and everything in between. And we're engaged in two broad areas of activity, both collaborating or sharing of best practices and ideas and experience, but also sharing cyber threat information. So basically on the collaboration side, we basically create environments where individuals can get together to share those best practices and ideas, whether that be on weekly threat analyst calls, whether that be on technical webinars. We run discussion boards. We run some interesting working groups where organizations have got together to work on specific problems that they could not be able to resolve on their own. We had one recently just concluded where one of our members was subjected to a particular kind of attack that they just could not seem to prevent coming through. So we got some representatives from a couple of other sectors to come in, and the group was able to sit down in fairly short order, come up with a solution to stop those attacks from coming through. So what's that benefit? It's the power of collaboration. And again, it's the kind of activity you couldn't buy anywhere. This is some great experts just getting together and saying, look, I've got a different way of doing this. Let's give this a try. and it works as they go through the process. And then the other side of it is actually involved in cyber threat sharing. So it's sharing of that threat information, those insights that they see coming in. So we get information that comes in from what we call our subscribers or our members, it comes in an anonymized way. So we don't go back and say, this came from bank X or company Y coming through. So it gets anonymized. It goes into our data center, where we have some analysts that then produce a variety of reports that are coming out. We also have a very close relationship with the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity. I mentioned that's the new federal government's entity. As a matter of fact, one of their executives actually sits as an advisor on our board of directors. So we get the information and advice coming in from the federal government, and then we can provide that out to other organizations. And one of the things that works quite nicely on that, where this is a sort of very synergistic exchange environment, is with the threat information or the technical advice coming out from the federal government is meant to cover wide areas. And we'll then see companies getting together and say, okay, the federal government's come up with this advice. I'm getting ready to operationalize that. Has anyone done it in this kind of environment, or running this kind of other software? Is there anything I need to be thinking about when I go to install or implement or change it to follow the federal government's ideas? And this comes through time and time again, where companies come through and say, wow, if I'd done it the way I planned on doing it, it would have taken me 2 or 3 weeks. You've now cut that down to a couple of days. So it's that real collaboration that's going on between the federal government and the private sector. And this is a way to actually do it. So it extends the reach or the capability of the federal government to reach a lot of those sectors that fall outside, for example, outside the critical infrastructure sectors. About 3/4 of our members are small and medium-sized organizations. We also talk to other organizations around the world to see what's going on globally. But what we want to be doing is giving advice back to Canadian companies from a Canadian perspective. They want to know what's going on, because companies are not in the business of being cyber threat analyst organization. They're in the business of selling or buying or manufacturing or providing services. That's what they want to do. So what we can do is take a look at that global environment and then say, okay, out of that global environment, here's what you need to do. Here's what you need to be thinking about. And here's where and how you might want to be thinking about protecting your organization. And so they can actually use that information to start to inform some of those strategic business decisions that they've got to be doing as they go through. Because ultimately what we want to be doing is increasing the cyber resilience, not only of the companies that belong to the Canadian Cyber Threat Exchange, but also to the economy at large. Because quite frankly, if Canada starts to suffer in any area significantly, from a cyber perspective, that's going to spill over. And it's going to affect the entire economy. And quite frankly, will affect all of us as individuals. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to raise that up in the spectrum. And at that, I will turn it back to you, Bob, for any questions that the audience has.
Now I virtually reappear. Thank you, Bob. That was a very insightful presentation, was very much appreciated. And I must admit, I'm delighted to see the CCTX blossom like that, because I remember we had you present when it was initially, in its origins, and now it's turned into a full-fledged, very useful organization that fills a real niche within Canadian society. I have a couple of questions for you that came in from the audience. So what I'll do is I'll basically get them. How is Canada prepared to fend off cyber attacks from a nation state as compared to other countries such as our southern neighbor? And is there anything we can do to increase the security posture?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that occurred when the government created the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity, so a part of CSE, they also changed the legislation for CSE, and they gave CSE some additional authority. So one is the ability to reach out and protect the private sector. So that's a new authority. They didn't have that capability before to broadly do that. So that's at a very broad level. But they also gave CSE the authority to go through and undertake what they call cyber effects. Now, there's a whole series of control mechanisms in place in terms of authorities and getting authority who can actually do that, but allows CSE to go out and actually could conceivably disrupt a foreign cyber attacker that's trying to come in and launch attacks against Canada. So that's very similar to what goes on, and we see reading in the press going from the National Security Agency in the United States from their on the military component within their cyber center. So they tend to talk about it. So we have that. The CSE has that legal authority to actually undertake that kind of activity. The other thing that Canada did when creating the new cyber center is they brought all of the sort of the cyber defense capability of the government into one center, and they can then provide from one center that advice out to the entire private sector. So unlike in the United States, where you've got a couple of organizations, so for example, National Security Agency provides the cyber threat information out to the defense sector, and Department of Homeland Security provides it out to the private sector and the government. In Canada, we have that all as one entity. So I think from a structural and authorities perspective, we've done a good job at doing that. Are there other things that we could be doing? Yeah, there's always other things you can be doing, but one of the things I'd like to comment on is the legislative framework that sits in behind information sharing. And I think that's an area where the federal government could go through and make some tweaks to legislation to basically create a safe harbor for private sector that want to share information. They have to share some information back to regulators in the federal government. Yes, that's given. But there's other information that companies could be sharing, but they're worried about civil liability if they start to do that. So creating a safe harbor legislatively would encourage companies by giving them the legal protection to engage in more sharing. And that's a benefit not only to the federal government, because the federal government will get information other than just what they're required or they can get by statute. And the same thing for the private sector. They could be sharing more broadly going across it. So we've got some good structures in place. We've got some good foundation pieces in there. We've got some good technical capability, but I think there's a couple of these other things that we could probably be doing to bolster that on the other side.
Okay, thank you. I didn't realize this the CSE mandate, but with the the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity being stood up, I think it's a great step. The next question I would like to ask you is: the government of Canada's legislative framework currently sufficient to support threat sharing and related investigations? I know you've answered that to a certain degree in your previous question. Is there anything we can do to make it more responsive?
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly that's, was just mentioning the ability to share information without sort of suffering from legal consequences, usually civil liability. And there, what I'm talking about, for example, is the company comes forward and shares information about a particular vulnerability that they've found or a particular threats that they're seeing. And so this is falling below the threshold of what they have to report from a statutory regulatory perspective. So it's falling below that threshold. What companies are worried about is if their shareholders find out that, wow, this attack was going on, or I didn't realize that, this was a vulnerability, is that going to affect my shareholder value and I want to sue you for it? There's no incentive for a company to want to come forward and share. And a lot of companies are doing that anyway. They're running the risk. But we could get more companies wanting to do that. And I think it's critical that companies increasingly share and cooperate together. I mentioned that none of them can do it on their own. So how do we incentivize them for doing it? We could also do things, for example, in the defense sector for the industrial technical benefits package. You want Canada's defense sector, the defense companies, to have robust cybersecurity for obvious reasons. They're subject to attack. There's some things we literally don't want to get leaked out of there, and we don't want to lose their capability. But when you apply for technical benefits from ISED, you can't use membership in something like a threat sharing organization. So that would be an easy way for the government to come through at no cost to them and say, okay, if you're participating in information sharing on cyber threats, it's protecting your ability to operate and continue operating as a digital or as a defense contractor, we'll let you count that towards an industrial technical benefits part of it. So I mean, that's another easy thing. And again, in that case, it's a no. Both these examples I'm giving you, there's no cost to the government actually going through and doing that. And then any thing that the government could be doing to increase how companies invest in cyber defense will be welcome, whether those be tax credits that can be applied going through it, in some way to financially assist organizations going through. That will be another area where the government could take a leading role in doing those sorts of things. They're already doing excellent work, as I say. The Cyber Center does a fabulous job of getting threat information out to companies, technical advice coming out to companies, and they received the bulk of the funding through the budget that was just announced. But I think there's some other things that the government will be doing and getting some of that financial assistance out to the private sector.
Thank you very much. I've got one last question. Blockchain has been a fairly effective technique, and is there any encouragement within government to basically go from traditionalized, centralized systems to much more of a decentralized one like blockchain?
We're starting to increasingly see that come up in the literature on cybersecurity, falling into the best practice domain. It's going to be a while before it becomes, I'll call it, mainstream within the cyber defense community. And one of the challenges we have is, in reflecting back on that statistic I had on the number of small medium-sized companies in Canada, a lot of them aren't doing some of the basics in cybersecurity. Like the majority of them aren't doing some of the basics. So blockchain is an excellent tool, but I think there's a bunch of things we've got to be encouraging companies to be doing at the front end of this process, and then start to think about, how can we start doing blockchain? Certainly for the bigger organizations, the banks, the telecommunications services, you can go down the list of critical infrastructure areas. They're looking at this and looking to adapt it quickly, but in relative terms, that's a small number of companies, critical that they are. But for the economy, we've got to be starting to think about what are some of those best practices that we can do that are easily implementable for the private sector. Even things like multi-factor authentication. How do we encourage companies to do that? How, from a technology perspective, do we make it easier, less cumbersome? So I think there's some opportunities in there for the private sector on the technology side to come up with some solutions that they can start doing it as they start to build. And as you get into the blockchain side of it, how would you start to make that really easy for that small 10-person company to actually install or implement or take advantage of blockchain?
And now we have another last question. With the Internet of Things, taking something like the electrical grid and its hardening against cyber attack, Internet of Things opens up a whole new dimension. And I'm just wondering right now, are you working with industry? Are you working with infrastructure to harden their systems now that a lot of this stuff is all being interconnected and vulnerable?
Absolutely. I mean, it's a great question. I mean, the Internet of Things is opening up a whole new dimension of cybersecurity. We're not doing the solution side of work. We put companies together to talk about it, so we don't actually build the solutions as such. But what we're doing is raising the awareness of why that is such a challenge and something that's got to be focused in on for companies. So it's both the Internet of Things, but also the connection of operational technology and corporate technology. So it's a slight variance. So both of those together are a completely new attack vector that we're having to start to deal with. In some cases, it's that goes back to what I was saying before. It's that old legacy system, that computer that's been sitting over in the corner running and doing all those programs for years. It does a great job, and all of a sudden now you connect it up to the internet. And so in some instances, you actually can't add on any security into that. So you're exposing your whole operational capability of your company to potential cyber attacks and shutting down your system, whether that attack come directly into the operational technology first, or it migrates because they've done an attack into the corporate IT system and goes into the operational side. The same thing is starting to happen on the IoT devices, and you start to think about where IoT devices are deployed. And I'm thinking a building, for example. All the things that about 85% of everything that operates in a building is connected up in some way through the internet into some kind of a centralized device. So the vulnerability of keeping office buildings open is all affected on the Internet of Things. And you could go through, whether that be the house, the business, you name it, we're connecting all those together, and it starts to create a new vulnerability environment. going forward. And we've got to start bringing in some changes that are going to force, for example, that you have to be able to change the default password, for example, on an IoT device. Every IoT device cannot come out with the same password on it, but that's what we were doing. So once you broke into one, you will get into all of them. So there's some practical things like that the industry business can start to do to try to harden down some of those IoT devices.
Last question. Quantum computing. What is that going to do with respect to encryption and the like, and the implications for that, and hardening Canadian business and people against quantum computing hackers?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the concern is that at some point in time, and the experts can debate on whether that's a 5 or 10 year period, the quantum computers will have the ability to break existing encryption. So companies have to start today thinking about, what's the data that they've got and what's the shelf life of that data if you're talking about intellectual property. So if you've got intellectual property that you think you need to keep secret from competitors for a 15-year period, pharmaceutical, for example, or new chemistry or something that's come out, you're going to get value out of that for the next 15 years. So you've got to keep it secret. And if you start to think that a quantum computer will be available in 10 years, it can break that encryption that's protecting that intellectual property, you've got a problem, because you're still expecting a 5-year window in there where your data is going to be protected, and it's not. So companies have got to start thinking today on how do they start to harden down their system to become resilient to quantum computing coming out. And there's some encryptions that are coming out from NIST in the United States, a new standard that's coming out on encryption that will start to help that. So larger organizations have got to start thinking about about the effect of quantum computing arrival, but they've got to start thinking about it today, because if you wait a year or two down the road, it's going to be too late. Because the thing that attackers will do is steal your intellectual property today. They won't do anything with it until their ability to break that encryption comes at year X, at 10 years out. But they're stealing that intellectual property from you today, knowing they're going to be able to exploit it before you wanted to actually release it to the public. So this is an immediate problem for organizations to start to look at. Certainly the bigger organizations, banks, for example, have active programs where they're starting to look at quantum computing, not only from the defensive side, so how do you protect your systems, but also from the opportunity side. What will some of these new technologies be able to do for us in the future that currently we just don't have the computing power to be able to do?
Well, Robert, thank you ever so much for a great presentation. It was greatly appreciated, and for taking the time to present to this particular conference. Anyways, we will monitor what's happening on the cctx.ca. You see that on your screen. I would recommend you become familiar with this particular organization, as well as the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity. So without further ado, thank you very much. It was an excellent presentation, very well received by everybody. And anyways, hopefully see you again next year.
Okay, thank you very much.
Update on that. Thank you very much. So this concludes our second plenary session. We're going to have a break now, and we're going to go to, and at 10:15, what we're going to be doing is starting, at 10:10, we're going to be starting with Emma O'Connell. She's the Chief Data Officer over at Employment and Service Development and Social Development Canada. So we'll be talking about data strategies, and that'll be followed by Eric Sweden from the U.S. National Association for State CIOs. We'll be talking about how the American states are driving digital acceleration. So without further ado, take a bit of a break, and we'll see you again in 10 minutes time. Thank you.